Okay, so I'm going to include bits of maths here. So we're going to see probably our first numbers. So what I tend to do with students as well, usually for the first couple of days, is I tend to go over the junior cert stuff. The reason I say that is because I know a lot of students have come from TY. Now, having done TY myself, I can attest the fact that there's like barely any maths covered. So I really don't want to lose any people who came from TY who haven't done maths in quite some time. So I'm going to just list off a few topics and then go through like an example or two of sort of typical junior cert style questions so that we can sort of rebuild our math skill up a little bit. You'll often hear me whenever I'm teaching use the analogy that if you're trying to teach a baby to swim, which is almost like trying to teach a person who did TY maths again, but essentially you don't want to drop them into the Atlantic Ocean. That's a really bad idea. So you have to start with the kiddie pool. So you have to go back to basics, and only then can you sort of work up to having the courage, in the case of that, just to start swimming the ocean. So some main topics I would recommend revising. Um, Firstly, it would be to solve equations. Now, this both means the sort of linear equations. So, for example, 4t minus 3 equals 11. You should be able to solve that pretty easily. It's not going to get you a nice number, I just realized, but you should be kind of used to ways of representing an answer if it's not a whole number. As well, you should be proficient in solving quadratics, at least using the minus b formula. Now, I'll come to that with the fact that there's about 4 or 5 different ways to solve quadratics, but I don't teach them. Instead, if you use the minus b formula for everything, it works out pretty well. So in general, you should be okay in solving equations of both linear and quadratic form. And then on that, also be proficient in solving simultaneous equations. Now, we will go through simultaneous equations in two variables again, but just to remind you of the basics. So sort of basic, two variable, simultaneous. So in terms of algebra, if you can solve equations fine enough and simultaneous equations, that's a decent bit of it covered. If you're able to sort of manipulate equations as well. Another thing to note is the laws of indices. So we will be using the laws of indices quite a lot in our, especially in calculus, where we can simplify things using the laws of indices. So the one that I see students crop up, or the students complain about, and have seen mistakes crop up, is what I was meant to say, is to note that x to the power of a half, where x is some real number, is entirely equivalent to saying the square root of x. So that's one thing I've seen a lot. That's just one example. In general, if x is a fractional power, then it takes on the following form. Typo, takes on the following form. Now, note that all of these are actually in the log table, so it's perfectly fine to completely omit them from memorization, but I would highly recommend it. Now, a couple of other major topics. The basics of linear sequences. So with linear sequences, simultaneous come up in it, as well as solving equations, but also utilizing formulas can come with linear sequences. We will remind ourselves of linear sequences once we get to that chapter, but we'll be delving in a lot deeper to the sort of topics involving sequences, because there are actually different kinds. Quadratic sequences we don't necessarily touch a whole load. So after that, I would like you to revise the coordinate geometry of the line. That can also come up. We will be utilizing the line quite a bit, as well as using the formulas that you would have developed in junior cert. So the ideas of distance between 2 points, midpoint, slope, as well as perpendicular lines when that happens to be the case. So all 4 of these we'll be using quite a lot. Even especially in the circle, you'd be surprised about how much we use the topic of perpendicular lines. Just a couple other things. Basic trigonometry. So you can split trig, at least in junior cert, to the two things of Pythagoras as well as SOHCAHTOA, which is inclusive of the inverse trig as well. So those two also quite important because a lot of the trigonometric knowledge we will build up relies on us knowing these like the back of our hand. Two more things. Again, these will just be the basics of these particular things, but probability and statistics. So the simple bits of probability that you would have done in junior cert, such as kind of measuring the expected frequency and using Venn diagrams, we'll be using those quite a bit. In the ideas of probability and statistics, the sort of mostly theory bits of it, because that seems to be a point where students kind of don't really like learning it. So it's best just to learn it early so it's kind of stuck in your long-term memory somewhere and you can save the short term for any of the more difficult things. So those are the main things that I would recommend you revise. I will maybe do an example question or two involving each one of these, but there's one more thing I want to touch on. So I know I keep saying I'll end this particular chapter, but there's nothing I want to mention, and it will be in the next video.